project window is the hub for all the assets you will work with inside of After Effects. As an editor, you'll often work with numerous stills and video to bring into your edit, but to work with them in After Effects, assets must first be imported into the project window. Here in this movie, we'll take a look at how to import pictures into the project window and set up some simple animation. So there's a number of ways to import assets into After Effects, the first of which is the common file import. So we can go to File, Import, File, and we'll get our open dialog box from which we can select one or more images and import into After Effects this way. Alternately, we can double-click on our project window and do the same functionality. And lastly, we can import via the OS dialog box itself. We can click and drag multiple images and assets into After Effects this way. Now, as we start to import in something like PSDs where we have multiple layers, let's go ahead and switch over to Photoshop for a second. And you'll see in this PSD that I'm going to import into After Effects, I've got three layers. I've got a ruins layer, I've got this water view, and I've got this aerial. And they're all smaller than the actual canvas itself, as you can see here. So let's go back into After Effects. And now, when we open this PSD, we get a second dialog box before we can import. And this is telling us, do we want to import this PSD as footage, as a composition, or as a composition retaining layer sizes? Let's see what each one does. If we import as footage, we have the option to merge all the layers. And if we do that, we just get the flattened image. So 1, 2, 3 images on top of each other, and we can't really separate those out. So let's go ahead and re-import that PSD using this other option here, still as footage, but now we can say, hey, I want to import just one layer from that PSD, and I want it to be the water view layer. And we can import this in as the document size or the layer size itself. So if we say document size, we'll get a bit of padding there as it imports in to the document size versus the layer size, which is going to crop it down just to the confines of the layer itself. So let's go ahead and import that. So now when I bring this into my composition, you'll see that the bounding box conforms to the limits of the image itself instead of the composition. So let's delete that. When we import a PSD, we also have the option to import it in as a composition. So this is going to import in just like the PSD when we had it open inside of Photoshop. This time it's going to create a brand new composition and import the individual layers as footage items inside this folder here. So let's double click that composition and you'll see, just like in Photoshop, we have layers 1, 2, and 3. The only difference is here, because we said composition, is that, let's go ahead and solo this. Our bounding box, you'll notice, is to the composition and not the layer. And that's true for each of these layers, the water view layer and the ruins layer. So you may or may not want this. It's just good to be aware that that is what happens when you import this in just as a composition. By contrast, if we import that same PSD and do the third option, composition retain layer sizes, now we have another composition, but now this time, layer 1, the bounding box is conforming to the image for each layer. And lastly, when we're importing images into After Effects that have sequential numbering, so these woods images, I've got 1, 2, and 3, we can click over here to the options box, and we want to make sure that if we want to import these things individually, to disable this importer JPEG sequence. If this is enabled, watch what happens when I import these 3 items. They become one item that I import into After Effects, and the 3 images become 3 frames in After Effects. 1, 2, 3, all on one layer. It's reading it as an image sequence. Sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. And if you want to import each one of these as an individual footage item, just make sure that this imported JPEG sequence is turned off. And then you can multi-select them, and they'll show up as 1, 2, 3 distinct images. So let's go ahead and delete all that. I'm going to import a few more images here. We'll keep our aerial, bird, bookmark. Let's add city rail, and of course the Cliffs of Insanity. Let's click and drag all these either into the composition icon here, in the composition window, or in my timeline. Either way, they'll all get imported into here. And I'm just going to solo this first aerial image. And let's add some simple keyframes here to get some animation going. I'm going to twirl this down and go to transform. And I think maybe at about 25 frames, let's go ahead from 0 to 25. We'll have an animation of this layer scaling up and dissolving on. So this is our final resting place at frame 25, so I'm going to work backwards here. Let's go ahead and set a keyframe for scale and opacity. And let's rewind to frame 0. And for scale, I'm just going to type in 0, 0 for opacity. And now when we preview, you'll see that get a nice simple animation of it growing and slamming into place. I'm not a big fan of the slamming, so let's go ahead and take these end keyframes here, and let's right-click and go to Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease In. And now we'll get a bit of a smoothing in or slowing in to that last keyframe so it's not so abrupt of an end. Okay, we've done that, and that's a simple animation that we've applied to one layer. I want to take that and do the same thing for this layer 2. Well, I can certainly come through and do the whole same process of setting keyframes for scale and opacity, and that's a lot of work if I'm doing it for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers. Let's not do it that way. Instead, let's go ahead and copy our animation from our first layer, and let's go down to our second layer, and now, let's solo this. Let's make sure we rewind to the very beginning, and we can paste our animation. And when we twirl down, you'll see that we have the same keyframes for scale and opacity, and we have the same move for our second layer. So let's do that for the bookmark, the city rail, and of course, the Cliffs of Insanity. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 now have the same animation as the original layer. 100%, of course, is a little bit different on each of these layers because they're all sized up a little differently, but that's okay. We can change that later if we wanted to. But for now, we just saw how we can import multiple images in a number of different ways. And we also saw how we can add a few keyframes to one layer and just copy it down to other layers by the simple copy-paste function.